Good evening, good evening, good evening. May not be many of us, but we're wholehearted and happy. And let me tell you, if you didn't already sneak a treat, you'll be high on sugar when you when you go home. Woo! They're wonderful. But meanwhile, we're going to find out a whole lot about Clarence Johnston, the whiz of an architect who has built lots of things around here. And you know Kristen Anderson. I think you're all regulars, and you don't need any more introductions from me. You probably also know where the bathrooms are. The closest is right back there by the Como entrance. And go to it, Kristen.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I hope, Andy, can you check to see if we are actually online? Have you looked at that already? We've had a few technical difficulties, perhaps because of our hiatus in January. And I had a month of technical difficulties because I had COVID. That was really something. But we are hoping that things are broadcasting and showing up as expected. And if not, we will modify and adjust, and I'll make sure that everybody has a chance to see and hear the presentation one way or another. We're live. Okay, that's good. That's very good. That's what we want to be. All right. Now I need to find my remote. Andy, oh, here it is right here. Clarence Johnston in St. Anthony Park. That's the story for tonight. But, of course, some announcements as we get started. The first of which is that if you missed the messages at the time of the January cancellation, or I think I put it in yesterday's message as well, the missing Lundy presentation, for folks who were trying to find it online, it happened here. If you were here in person, you're saying to yourself, what missing Lundy presentation? Because it did happen here, but it didn't happen online. So it is recorded specially, no audience, which is a little weird not to have the responses, but that's all right. It's there, slides, information, and all the rest. I'm going to leave that up until the end of February. Okay, so the Lundy presentation is there and available. On Thursday, here, same bat time, same bat place, we will be looking at the Milton Square complex. This is a presentation for the St. Anthony Park Branch Library Association. They asked for a presentation on Milton Square, and I have had lots of fun putting this together. And I hope that you'll be able to come and learn a few things. We'll come back to this picture a little bit later because even though this is a Milton Square picture, there's some cool stuff happening in the background. You'll see it later. A month from now, March 11th, we will be visiting the University Grove. And I mean that like in the presentation mode. We're not going up there because it'll probably still be winter. But we'll be wandering around with slides and having a look at the University Grove. Then, as scheduled, St. Paul campus is April 8th. And then here's the surprise. On the 5th Tuesday of the month, when I hope there are no standing conflicts about this club meeting and that organization meeting, we're going to sneak in the Missing Commonwealth presentation. I had a little sore throat on the day of the presentation, and I canceled because I didn't think things were going to go just right. Then I had the worst cold of my life. And then about 10 days later, I took a COVID test, and I had COVID. No fever, no headaches, just a horrible cold. So Commonwealth fell by the wayside, but we're picking it back up again. Tuesday, April 29th, 7 o'clock, here and on the YouTube channel, just kind of following the regular procedures. And then the season ends with the Hampton Park neighborhood on May 13th. So that's what's coming up. It seems strange, but I've already been talking with Mary about, is there a next year? Should I do walking tours? So if you have any opinions about that, feel free to let me know what you think. Because it is strange to be in February and thinking about the sun. Well, no, actually, it's not strange to think about summer when you're in February. It's sometimes the only thing I can think about. But I am kind of looking ahead and just trying to be planning things appropriately. If you want to check to see what's going on and you haven't saved your copy of the Bugle or you haven't seen the reminder announcement, you can always go to kristenanderson.org/events. And you can see a notice like this for April 29th. It's the presentation I told you about just a moment ago. You can also see all the other stuff that I have going on. So kristenanderson.org/events is the place to get information about the next presentation or a month out or marking your calendar, all that sort of thing. Also, just a reminder, you can have endless fun at kristenanderson.org/sapmaps, which is where you can see all the plat maps. And then, one last reminder, I am leading a tour to Norway in September. There are brochures up here in the front. Now is the time to make a decision. I think it's the beginning of April when the registration and deposit deadline come up. So that's the deadline for deciding if the tour goes and for you deciding if you're going to go on the tour and all that sort of thing. So you can find that address here on my website right there. This is the front page. I've scrolled down a little bit. So there's the link that will take you to the online brochure and registration information. All right, housekeeping aside, here we go with Clarence Johnston in St. Anthony Park. There he is, all dressed up, probably in the 1890s, I'm guessing, for that picture. Clarence Johnston was born in Waseca County, Minnesota. His family moved around a bit in the 1860s. By the late 1860s, they had settled in St. Paul. And I'll tell you a little bit about his training in a minute, but he had a very successful practice. Lots and lots of buildings, often described as Minnesota's most prolific architect. And the firm actually carried on for about 25 years after his death. If you are interested in learning more about him, you maybe saw this program. This is not last week TPT. This is a few years ago. But you can go to tpt.org and find the video for Gracious Spaces, Clarence H. Johnston, Minnesota architect. It's a great little film. And there's also this terrific book, which is a little harder to get your hands on. There's one copy in the St. Paul Public Library. It's not checked out, so you might be the first to request it. There's one copy that I found on Amazon. There's one on eBay. There's a lot of them out there. It's from 1996, and it is the definitive biography of Clarence Johnston. And I'll be using information from this and some pictures. So if you can get your hands on it, if you're interested in Johnston, it's a wonderful resource by Paul Clifford Larson. Okay, our young friend, Clarence Johnston, arrives in St. Paul as a 9-year-old, 8 or 9-year-old. Into the 1870s, mid-1870s, when he's still a teenager, he starts to work for an architect named Radcliffe, who in 1873 had this kind of advertising image published in the Andreas Atlas. And it was basically to show lots of fancy buildings in downtown St. Paul and downtown Minneapolis and around Minnesota. But in this case, the Ingersoll building had the offices of Radcliffe and Buffington, two of Minnesota's early professional architects. And like his friend, sometime frenemy, Cass Gilbert, who's over on the right, Johnston was trained as an architect by working in an architect's office. It was a kind of apprenticeship. It was a chance to see how things work, to learn all the aspects of the business, to start at the bottom rung and work one's way up. And both Gilbert and Johnston were doing this. Gilbert, by the way, was born in 1859, and his family came to Minnesota in the late 1860s from Zanesville, Ohio. So they had a similar trajectory in a lot of ways. In the late 1870s, these two guys went to MIT, which had started a brand new architecture program. So the idea that there might be such a thing as an architecture school was pretty unusual. And our two Minnesota boys go out east to Boston. That's where MIT was at the time. This is the original MIT building. Cass Gilbert sticks around and does a couple semesters there. Clarence Johnston drops out after one semester because he didn't have the money to stay. And the money turns out to be a problem for some other aspects of his architectural education. It was not only typical to work for an architect in an office, which Johnston had done, but it was also typical to travel to Europe, because then you could go around and see all these important buildings, and you could sketch the buildings and build a kind of notebook or portfolio that you could use then later on. And if you needed to know how to do a Corinthian capital with certain proportions, you could page through your notebook and you could find 3 or 4 examples from 3 or 4 different places you'd visited. So it was an important part of a young architect's education. Cass Gilbert managed to do it, but again, money was a problem for Clarence Johnston, and so he did not go. He was, however, fascinated by contemporary European architecture, and so, for instance, he was influenced by Richard Norman Shaw. This is one of Shaw's drawings, published in a book. While Johnston didn't have a chance to go to see his buildings, Shaw's buildings, he had a chance to see the drawings, and then he would copy the drawings. So he would do his best to get his hands on and his eyes on and get a feel for what was going on with these contemporary buildings. And what was going on at the time was that architects like Norman Shaw were looking around at old buildings and then embedding that vocabulary in the new buildings that they were designing. So if you come to the Milton Square presentation, you'll hear about Norman Shaw again because he had an interesting project that I think was directly influential for Milton Square. He had another project that you might know about. He did the interiors in the first-class areas of the Titanic. So the dining room on the Titanic was designed by Norman Shaw. So he was a pretty well-known guy, successful architect. He was working with these historic modes like half timber, working in a style that we would call Tudor, but it was sometimes being referred to as Queen Anne. Really influential for architects not only around the British Isles, but also here in the US. One thing that Johnston was able to do was to get some experience under his belt in places other than St. Paul. So he worked for a little while in the 1880s in New York for Herder Brothers and was involved in some fairly important projects where the Herder Brothers were working for wealthy, well-known clients. But then he comes back to St. Paul. And between 1882 and 1885, Johnston was working as an independent architect. And he designed these two buildings and a few dozen others in that 3 to 4 year period. These are houses on Summit Avenue. They're still there. They sit next to each other. So the house that's on the left is the Griggs house, and the house on the right is the Foster house. Griggs and Foster were business partners, and they bought 3 or 4 lots, and then they built their houses in a way that they not only faced Summit, there's the front door facing Summit, and there's the front door facing Summit, but that they also had side doors that faced a shared lawn. Here's the side door. And they made sure that that side lawn was not the appropriate size for anyone else to build a house in between. So they had this big space, and they had this connection back and forth. So Johnston designed both of these houses, and one thing they have in common is that they're very big, and the layout of the rooms would be similar. But you can see that they look different from each other. They're different styles. Architects at the time were doing that. They were very versatile in the different kinds of styles they would use, different materials that they might choose. And so rather than kind of setting it up and saying, well, I only do Richardsonian Romanesque, that's my thing. If you want something else, sorry, can't do it. They were perfectly comfortable switching things up. One interesting thing about this pair of houses, and this is still there as a matter of fact, Clarence Johnston did a shared carriage house. And you can see a little bit of the carriage house right here. It ran all the way along that shared lawn, and here's the other end of it, behind the Foster house. So they had that one building that was shared between the two of them. The house on the left, by the way, is the house that was sometimes considered to be haunted. There was a guy who published books related to the occult in the 1960s, and suddenly all these stories about haunted house came up from the 1890s and the 1920s, and all, I think, to promote the business that was going on in the house. Between 1886 and 1889, Johnston worked with William Wilcox, another architect, and in this partnership they produced more houses on Summit Avenue. They did the Driscoll House, that's 2 houses down from the James J. Hill House. The two of them designed this fabulous building, which is still standing. It's an old photograph, but it's called Riley Row, or Laurel Terrace. It's on Laurel. Laurel is the street that's running right to left in the slide. And then at an angle, Nina goes off towards Summit on the left. And so the building is kind of hinged with that big tower. It's a beautiful building. Now not 7 separate units, but divided up maybe into 20 apartments. but an amazing space, and considered to be one of the, I think Larry Millett calls it one of the best Victorian row houses in the United States. So high praise indeed for those young architects. Here's another set of row houses that they did. This is Summit Terrace, 587 to 601 Summit, and one of these houses, I think it's the second one from the left, is the place where F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote This Side of Paradise. So there's a historical marker out in front of this, but this is another of the things that they did, along with churches and some businesses and a kind of mix. So there's a mix of styles right away early in his career, and there's also a mix of types: homes, businesses, churches, schools, lots and lots of things come into play. So then he kind of launches off on his own and has a series of commission types. Again, lots and lots of variety. He does many buildings for the state. He becomes the state architect in about 1901. And that means that he gets jobs like Stillwater Prison. And it's not like there wasn't anything there, but if they need to expand or they need to remodel, then Johnston swoops in and does that work. He does all kinds of work for the University of Minnesota system all over the state. And so I'll show you some St. Paul campus buildings because, after all, if you look back at late 19th, early 20th century documents, it calls it the farm campus, and its address is St. Anthony Park. They don't say anything else about it except that it's in St. Anthony Park. But Northrop Auditorium, Walter Library, many of the late 19th through mid-20th century buildings. After Johnston's death, Kaufman Union was built in the modern style, and his son Howie, at that point, was in charge of the firm. He does state hospitals. He does the Home for the Blind and the Home for the Deaf and the Home for the Feeble-Minded and the insane asylums. And he does all of that kind of building for the state. So it's a tremendous amount of work that gets done. And not all of it is glamorous, as you'll see. Northrop Auditorium is kind of a glamorous showplace, but there was a lot of variety in what was done. Lots of other commissions as well. Here's the St. Paul Curling Club. This is one of Howie's first independent commissions. Howie the son, had recently been married. That is Clarence H. Johnston Jr., Clarence Howard Johnston. They distinguished one from the other by calling the son Howie. So Howie had recently been married. He and his new wife had gone to Europe, of course, for the honeymoon, but also so he could sketch and see all these buildings, just a really typical thing to do. And I've tried very hard to find the itinerary. They landed in Great Britain, and it would be lovely to find some indication that they went to Scotland, because when he gets back and he does the curling club, he does it in what's called the Scottish baronial style, like a Scottish manor. And I'm almost positive he saw not only historic buildings, but contemporary buildings that were being built using this style. Glensheen is a Johnston commission for the Congdon family, 1905 to 1908. So we might wonder, with his range of buildings, houses and churches and businesses and schools and all the rest, why didn't he start working in St. Anthony Park until about 1901? Why wait? What was the delay? Well, I think there are a couple of things. St. Anthony Park tried to start in 1873. That didn't work at all. And then they get started again in 1885, and things aren't necessarily booming right away as much as the developers tried to generate a boom. So there were a few big houses that were built, but kind of all accounted for in terms of the architects who designed them. And it was very typical for the St. Anthony Park Company to look to Minneapolis for their builders and their architects rather than look to St. Paul. So the fact that there maybe wasn't enough work when Wilcox and Johnston were underway, that the guys who were running the whole neighborhood were busy looking towards Minneapolis, not St. Paul. And then we did have a neighborhood guy who did, in fact, do a number of buildings here. So right there in the center is Charles Aldrich. He worked at the university. He taught mechanical drawing and architecture. He built himself a house on Keston. It's in the middle of the block, facing Como, between Doswell and Bourne, a little white house. So he lived in the neighborhood. He worked for the university. He designed the Armory on the Minneapolis campus. It's one of his many buildings. He designed the International Order of Oddfellows Hall. Now we say the Co-op. That's one of his buildings. A number of the factories in the industrial district. The oldest part of what became the Fisher Nut Company buildings. That's an Aldrich building. He designed the first big church for the Congregational Church. They had a smaller chapel from 1887, and they had grown sufficiently to need a bigger building. And in 1898, they built this, and Aldrich did the design, did the drawing for them. So here's his drawing, and here's the building as built, with the old chapel right here that then they added the church onto. So there already was a guy. In fact, he did a lot of work on the university campus, the farm campus. So before Johnston took over as the state architect, Aldrich was the guy who did a lot of these buildings. So here's the horticulture building. It's still there, although as you'll see in a few slides, it looks different. But this is Aldrich's 1890s view of things. It's now part of the big home ec design complex. So if you look at the outside of this building, it says McNeil Hall. And then if you walk past about 3 more buildings, a block later, it still says McNeil Hall on a completely different building. But that's what's here. It's not horticulture anymore. But the building still stands as redone by Clarence Johnston in the 1920s. So even though he didn't get an immediate start as the neighborhood began, he still did a lot of work around the neighborhood. And there is the problem, at least for me, and I'm trying not to make it your problem, there's the problem of organizing things. We could start the earliest, and then the next, and the next, and the next, and we'd be jumping all around. Or we could do types of buildings. We'll do a little bit of that, and we'll do a little bit of chronology. We could start at the south and work to the north. So, these are all Johnston buildings in and around St. Anthony Park, and I'm going to choose one of the earliest, a house, and then do the other residence space, and then we'll jump to the university campus where he was also doing some very early 20th century work and kind of moving on from there. So if you want to keep track of things and kind of think about what's going on, I'll just remind you about the variety of materials, the variety of styles. And some of that issue about the variety of styles can be accounted for by the fact that he had a very long career, 1880s until his death in 1936. So that's a decent explanation. But I'm trying to find this great little quote from Paul's book. And I'll look for just a couple more minutes before here we go. Don't give up too soon. So Paul Clifford Larson wrote, adapting an architectural vocabulary with 2,000-year-old roots to the rigors of a Minnesota climate was to him the height of modernist achievement. So he's trying to reconcile lots of things, lots of different uses. How do I use this style on this kind of building for this sort of client? What are the messages that are being sent? What are my materials? Is it stone? Is it brick? Is it frame? He's pulling all those things together and then is thinking very specifically about where he is and where his clients are and where he's working. So with that, we will start with some houses. He did not design either of these houses. These are Charles Buell houses from the 1880s. And you can maybe tell from the slide, there's the Methodist Church on the left. So we're on Hillside, looking towards Langford Park. These two houses are kind of variations on the standard theme that the builder Charles Buell used on a regular basis, both in what we now call North St. Anthony Park and South St. Anthony Park. The house on the left belonged to Oliver Baker, who was a real estate guy, and he had a bunch of kids that he raised in that house. One of them was a daughter named Alice, and the other was a daughter named Sadie. So Alice and Sadie grow up, they get married, and Dad figures out a way to get houses built for them, next door to each other. So Alice and William Plant live in the 1902 house, the White House, that's at the center of the slide, probably a Charles Aldrich design. So he's, again, working around the neighborhood. Right next door, to your right, that Queen Anne half-timber house is, there's the Plant house. And then over on the right is Harvey and Sadie Blodgett's house, designed by Clarence Johnston in 1901. They didn't stay there long. They moved to Topeka in 1904 and then came back to the cities. They had a place on Mississippi River Boulevard. They had a place on Summit Avenue eventually, but they started out in this very nice house that the father/father-in-law probably paid for. So the house is in the kind of style that Johnston had been using and would continue to use on Summit Avenue, for instance. It was a very popular style for residential architecture. We usually call it Tudor, although it still has some factors or some elements that are hanging on from the late 19th century. Most notably, some pretty strong, more than hints, suggestions, pretty strong examples of Queen Anne style. So if you look at the roof has all kinds of different shapes and lines and directions. They're big dormers that stick out from both sides, and they're not at the same height. So there's a lot of variety going on with this building. And then you can follow that variety down. Queen Anne buildings tend to have a lot of boxes, we might say, that are kind of assembled together, or bits and pieces of boxes. So in this case, we don't have the towers and the turrets that start out as a cut corner with a diagonal and then move to a rounded form up above. No towers here, but you can see there are these big gable fronts that extend up into dormers, and they extend outward. So they're breaking the box of the house, the basic walls of the house, by having those projecting sections for the second and third floors. And then downstairs on our side of the house, you can see there's a bay window. So there are a lot of different shapes going on there. The half timber, decorative half timber, is adding all kinds of texture and variety and movement and color. And it's not just verticals and horizontals. You can see there are some diagonals, and the diagonals have curves in them. So this is kind of turning up the volume on a number of those possibilities. You'll remember perhaps the Norman Shaw building from England from the 1880s that had lots of half-timber elements included in it. Half-timber buildings were pretty common in late medieval Renaissance construction, and as a result, many of them were built in the US, in the American colonies, because that was a type that was known. And they really were part timber and part something else. So there was a timber frame, and then they would fill in the open spaces with something that was kind of like basket weaving. They called it wattle and daub. They could put mud or bricks and then seal things up with a kind of clay or dung and straw, lots of different things to fill the spaces. So when we look at buildings like this, the inspiration was a building that had these great big timber frame elements that sometimes needed to be braced and held together with diagonals, and then what's white here would have been fill. So it's half timber and half something else. And by the time we get here, it's not a timber frame of that sort anymore. This is mostly surface decoration that was done with wood and stucco, for instance. But they liked the look of it, and so they continued to make use of it in these designs. And you can go up and down Summit. You don't have to be very far away from the houses at the far east before you start finding half-timber and Tudor-style houses. And the style remains popular well into the 1920s, so you can get way out towards St. Thomas, and you'll still be finding Tudor-style houses on Summit Avenue. A house like this is more expensive. A house like this has a certain sense of style that a plain box would not have, that a smaller box would not have. And so the idea was to make a statement, easier to do if your father/father-in-law gives you a great big lot to build on. So the house can be back a ways, it can be far away from other houses. It has a great big carriage house with it as well, as you'll see. There's the carriage house over there on the right, and the side of the house that faces towards the west. So you can see that there's another big dormer, but it doesn't drop down to the lower floor. Again, the more variety that can come into play, the better it was in terms of this style. And then they'll have things like clapboards and shingles and lots of different things covering the surface where they don't have the half timber going on. Here's a view inside that I grabbed from Zillow. The house is going to be on the market again in March or April. So if you're looking to live in a great big beautiful Clarence Johnston house, your chance is coming up soon. There's the bay window that we saw from the outside, and we're looking out the window at the Alice Plant house. Here's another view of that same room, this time towards Knapp. And here we're upstairs. There are 2 staircases in this house, fairly typical for large houses like this. I checked the city directories in 1904, the year that the Blodgetts were on their way out to go to Topeka. They had 2 live-in servants, and so they would use the back stairs, and the family would then use the main staircase. The video that TPT produced about Clarence Johnston is called Gracious Spaces, and it's a wonderful way of describing especially the residential architecture, and this certainly qualifies as an example of that. There's the carriage house, which is bigger than a lot of houses around. Here we're a little bit closer to it. You can see that although it's been turned into a garage and other kinds of space, it retains the opening for the hay to be lifted in, hoisted in. So this would have been, these folks would not have had to have called a livery service to pick them up with a wagon. They would have had their own carriages, they would have had their own horses, and they would have hauled in the straw and hay up here into the hayloft using this pulley on that thing. He did not design the Minnesota Boat Club building, but there's a really cool connection in this fabulous old photograph at the Minnesota Boat Club with a bunch of the members that ties us to Johnston's history and his colleagues in architecture and the next homeowner. So this is an early example of Photoshop. The photographer who took this picture, or these pictures, took all the images, but then pieced them together so that he could get people in the boats in the water and people on the landing and on the ramps, and so that he could get this whole image. And if we zoom in, we can see the people are all numbered, by the way, and then there's a list of everybody on the back of the photograph. So you can actually figure out who's who if you don't recognize their faces. But that's Cass Gilbert right there. And that's his partner, James Knox Taylor. And that guy right there is Clarence Johnston. Whether they enjoyed sports or not, these clubs were important connections for you to meet clients, to have your current clients introduce you to potential future clients, see and be seen. That was all really, really important. Here we're in a little bit closer. Again, our frenemy, Cass Gilbert, James Knox Taylor. There's Johnston. And this guy right there is the next client, John Wheeler Levitt Corning. He's one of the founders of the Minnesota Boat Club. He moved to St. Paul from the East Coast in 1867. He was already into rowing, and he shipped his scull by way of New Orleans to get it here. So no railroad for him. He didn't want all that bumping and jostling around. So he already has his boat that he wants to use, and he ships it all the way around via New Orleans and up the Mississippi River. And then helped to found this club, which is, I think, the oldest club in Minnesota. They still exist. So Corning was in a bunch of businesses. He worked for some of the famous downtown guys for a little while, and then got into brick making. The Corning Clay Works was one of his companies. They bought Chaska Brick and Tile. So he became really wealthy, because if you're making building materials at a time that there are zillions of buildings being built, a huge building and population boom in the Twin Cities, you're pretty well positioned. You're in good shape. He lived in a Johnston house from 1892 on Dayton Avenue, but in 1916, he commissioned Johnston's firm to build him a house on Langford, it was called. Hillside, we call it now. So it's actually right next door to the Blodgett house. And one of the reasons that he moved here, perhaps, is that his son, Charles, had been living at 122 Langford since 1904. So the neighborhood would have been familiar to him. This house, by the way, if you're trying to place it, you can stop right now. It sat where the elementary school is. So don't waste any more time trying to figure out where you've seen that house before. If you were around before the elementary school was built, you maybe remember it, but probably not. So Charles Corning lived in this house. When when the Johnston family first came to St. Paul, they lived next to or near the Corning family. So they'd been neighbors way back in the 1860s. And then John Corning's, another of his sons, Clarence, lived in Crocus Hill right next to Clarence Johnston. So there were lots and lots of connections, and that was really typical. Even now we joke about Saint Small, and it was even more the case back in the day. So here's the house that J.W.L. Corning got from the Johnston firm. It was designed by Howie, but of course Clarence was there and watching everything, so it wasn't a big deal. Here's the Blodgett house, right back there. There's the Clarence Johnston designed basketball hoop. I forgot to point that out before. It's right there. And then the carriage house is just behind this corner. So in these few views that we look at, pay attention to the brickwork on the house. It's a little bit more elaborate than you would find in other places. And of course that makes sense because the guy was in the brick business. Here's the front of the house as it faces the street. Notice the borders around the windows. It's pretty unusual to find that extensive use of brick. And it's kind of an interesting house in terms of its layout. The kitchen is at the front right as we look at the house. And the entrance that you see on the left enters the house about the middle, and it goes into the living room, which is at the back of the house. It's very different from what you would find in a standard house, but it does give some indication that they're starting to break the box a little bit. They're trying to think in some different ways about how they were going to use space. Here's another view of it from the Blodgett side of things, looking towards the south. And here they put an addition on the house for the garage, and I think they also did this dormer bump up in the ceiling. But it's a little kind of storybook in its style, kind of charming. The jerkin head, we call it, when the gable is clipped like this and comes straight down. That's something that shows up on a lot of sort of storybook style houses. The brickwork, of course, is something else that's really fascinating about it. Well, we switch from those residences to another kind of residence. This is what we now call in the business a residence hall dormitory, right? This was on the St. Paul campus. It's Dexter Hall. And it was on Cleveland, north of where Bailey Hall sits. There's actually an open space with a bunch of trees there. And so south of the gym and north of Bailey Hall, that was a 1902 commission for a boys' dormitory. They had some interesting issues on the St. Paul campus, and I'll talk more about this when I talk about the St. Paul campus, but it wasn't just the agriculture-related departments. It was home ec and agricultural and mechanical stuff, but it was basically three programs. There was a college program, but there was also kind of a high school program, and then there was the extension program. So they had younger kids who were on campus often for shorter periods of time, and then they had the traditional college students. And so they had a bunch of dormitory arrangements that they made in part by who was going to be living where and with whom. But here we get a fairly ornate building, not like anything we've seen yet out of his work, but he's more than happy to show off his skills for some of these early university buildings. Here is the administration building. On the university farm here, it says St. Paul, Minnesota. I mentioned it often says St. Anthony Park, but this must be a little bit later. We now know this as Coffee Hall. 1906 is when this was built, shortly after the U acquired the land that it was sitting on, plus the whole lawn area. That was somebody's farm. And so the U had bought north of that up to Larpenteur, and they'd bought to the east of it, but this property was kind of held out until about 1906, about the time they built this building. And then two more buildings to match, again by Clarence Johnston, as we move south along Eccles, the agricultural engineering building and the dairy husbandry building. They're not identical, but they have the same flavor, so we read them as a set of buildings. And that's one of the advantages of having a single architect in charge of many of the projects. Often, if there's a different architect coming in, they'll say, hey, look at me, and I'm here to make things better, or that dumb building next door, wait till you see what I'm going to do. If a single architectural firm is doing it, they, of course, are more respectful of the work that was done before because it was their work. Here we're inside the campus. Cleveland is over on the left. Dexter Hall would have been up from this ball field, up just next to what was a health service building, also, by the way, Clarence Johnston's firm. Now it's part of the chiller plant. Dexter Hall would be just off the slide to the left. Here's the gym, 19-teens building, and in the early plans for the campus, the playing field and the gym were important parts of this. A lot of the original campus was up here to the north of Buford. Buford wasn't even a street for a while. And so a lot of Johnston's early work is up at this end of the campus. Here's McNeil Hall, the name of about 4 other buildings, all connected to each other. We're now up the hill from the horticulture building, which we'll see again in just a minute. And this was the first of the home ec buildings that Johnston built. There was an older home ec building. It was too small. They needed a modern facility, and so Johnston gets the call to do this. It's a lovely building with tile and brickwork. So he's taking care not to just throw up a bunch of boxes. One interesting thing about the farm campus, you'll hear me say this again in a couple of months, it's not just an institution of higher education with students and staff and faculty and residence halls and dining halls and classrooms. There are animals and there are plants. And so there are all kinds of different buildings that need to be built. And Johnston didn't say, oh, call in somebody else for that. I don't do barns. I don't do silos. Never mind. He jumped right in and would do things that matched older farm-like buildings that were on the campus. He did the horse barn, which was torn down a few years ago for the Cargill building. This is the seed agronomy house. And you can see that it's got a gambrel roof. It's all about the farm language. And he didn't pick and choose out of these projects. He did exactly what they asked for. Here's the horticulture building as designed by Charles Aldrich. And here it is as modified by Clarence Johnston in the 1920s, when it was about 25 years old. So one of the things that happened is that the building was expanded to the east. So in this case, the right end of the building. And then while we're looking at this, have a look at the windows on the first and second floors, and have a look at the bay window that's here at the center, and then there's another one below it, and then the door is down here. So if you've seen that, then you can make sense of the, second and third story windows. These are from the original building. There's the bay window and the window underneath it and the big doorway. It says horticulture right there in stone. Here's the addition with some, plainer stone/brickwork, but then that very complicated roof line goes away, and they put in a full story up there in addition to the big addition that went over to the right. And so it was praised by faculty who worked in the building. It's like, oh, we have all this space, and now we don't just have an icky attic, we've got real space up here, and it's so wonderful to have this new building. This is the animal husbandry building. Now it's the School of Social Work. It's another of the kind of Art Deco modern era projects that were being done around the time that Johnston died and that Howie had taken over the firm. And like a lot of these buildings, there are beautiful carvings on them. It's doing a carvings tour on the St. Paul campus would be a lot of fun sometime because there's some great stuff. We'll see these again in the Commonwealth presentation. Here's Coffee Hall, way up here, I think, unless that might be agricultural engineering and that might be Coffee Hall. These are the home management houses. This is Cleveland out here, and Commonwealth goes in on the side of this house to the east. These were built for the home ec department. They were replacing houses in the St. Anthony Park neighborhood that had a similar purpose, which was, if you were a home ec student, you would spend a semester living in a house with a bunch of other home ec students and a staff person and maybe a faculty member and a child. They had kids that they got from the Commonwealth, the Jean Martin Brown Receiving Home, Children's Home Society, that they would loan to the university for a semester. And they called them laboratory children. And they weren't all orphans. I read someplace just recently about little Susie's mom came to visit her at the home management house. So for whatever reason, these kids had been living at the St. Anthony, what is now the St. Anthony Park home, what was then an orphanage, and then they'd be placed out here. So Johnston designs these two houses, which replace There was a house on Langford, and there was a house on Knapp that were again used for the purposes of kind of living and learning for the home ec students. Again, another type of architecture, another type of form. More residence hall space. This is Thatcher Hall, also faced Commonwealth, and that's the fairgrounds off there in the distance at the left. This was space that was built, I think, in the 1940s and attempting to address the housing crisis after the Second World War. It was used for graduate students, often married students. They were apartments rather than dorm rooms. And then they had such a crunch getting space for faculty that they kicked all the graduate students out and housed faculty in the building. And the condition was that they could stay for 1 year while they found someplace to live, and then they had to move on. All right, we jump back to the earlier part of the 20th century for a look at some churches that Johnston did, or church work that he was called in to do. We're looking here at 3 views, too easy to see up at the top, and one down here. This is St. Matthew's first building from 1889. That's the Knapp Hill. That's where the Methodist Church sits. There's the Gutterson School right there. So Como's running along here. These 2 big houses are still there at the corner of Como and Commonwealth. So this is where St. Matthew's built first. And it was fine for 1889, managing the size of the population of the neighborhood, that sort of thing. Size of the building was okay. But by the time they got to the 19-teens, they were a little concerned that they needed to do something. They talked about moving into the Central Hall building, which was down where the strip mall is, along Energy Park Drive. They talked about remodeling this, and they talked about moving to a new building. For the remodeling project, Alice Plant, we've already met her, sister of Sadie Blodgett, Alice said, hey, you know, we should talk to Mr. Ellerby, neighborhood architect. If you listen in to the Milton Square project or presentation, you'll hear more about Ellerby. Or maybe we should check in with, this is the architect that they hired to consult, C. Johnson. And I thought, oh, shoot, when I first read that. It'd be so cool if it were Clarence Johnston. Well, it probably was, because when they actually hired him to design their new building on Carter, the person who took the minutes for the church wrote it down as C. Johnson again. Didn't get the idea that his name was Johnston. So I'm sure they were talking to Clarence Johnston about their church basement and what they could do to lower the floor or raise the ceiling or get some extra space in this area. The foundations of the building still survive. It looks, you know, decent sized here. But this house sits on its foundations. So this is on the Knapp Hill right across from the nursery school entrance in the Methodist Church. In fact, there's a little bump out right here. That's the tower. That's this. And I guess the basement is really tall, so kind of an unusual building in that sense. Here's another view of it. This is an advertisement from a newspaper that was published on the St. Paul campus for students. And part of the deal that all of these churches were keeping in mind is that the students on the campus were part of their potential flock, and that they needed to be convenient in paying attention. Well, one of the things that got the Methodists thinking about asking C. Johnson to come in and consult with them is that not the Methodists, St. Matthew's folks, is that the Methodists were ready to move out of this building and to build this building right across the street from where St. Matthew's was. So if you're in a little 1880s building and your co-religionists are building one of these across the street, you might, think about, do we need another building? Is anybody come to our church? Are they all going to go across the street, Methodist or not? So this was in the works at the same time that they were thinking about what to do. So they're here, and they decide they're going to move. And what they decide to do first, well, they move to this spot. The Congregational Church is built right here. The Episcopal Church is built back here. So this is Commonwealth running along here. This is Raymond. There's the Samuel Green house at Raymond and Commonwealth. This is the former train station. So now there's a house in between these, and then there's another house in here, and then this one was built. So that's where they ended up. And here's where they are, back to back. 2 churches built at exactly the same time. both designed by Clarence Johnston. So we'll get into the details of these buildings. Here they are again, St. Matthew's at the bottom of the slide facing Carter, and St. Anthony Park UCC facing Commonwealth at the top of the slide. Notice, by the way, the different shapes of the buildings. This is very much a basilica plan, long, narrow space. This is added on in the 1990s. They had space underneath in the basement. The church sits fairly high off the ground, so they had their sanctuary space, they had a chapel, and they had space underneath before they added on. The Congregational Church, on the other hand, has a bigger, longer sanctuary space, and then there's this big axis that cuts across the middle. I'll show you a plan and explain why that's there. This is Johnston working for two different denominations and understanding what each of them needed in terms of their space. Well, the Congregational Church got started a little bit earlier. Here's their 1880s chapel. It sat at Raymond and Energy Park Drive. Here's the chapel again with the Charles Aldrich addition, 1898 or so. By the 19-teens, they're thinking about moving, which seems like a pretty short lifespan on that building. But there was a Congregational church that closed in downtown St. Paul, and they decided to distribute their assets to other Congregational churches. And one of the things they said was to the St. Anthony Park people, we'll give you $11,500 or so, which was a lot of money at the time, if you build a new church closer to the university. And they go, oh, okay, we can do that. Here's a view of it when it was young, when it was new, not a lot of trees showing up around it. Again, Clarence Johnston comes in and does the design for this building. He was himself a member of a Congregational church, Park Congregational, so he understood the needs of the denomination and how their services and Sunday school ran. He knew all that. He understood it pretty well. Here's a view inside the sanctuary. And what's most notable about this is not just the size. It was a fairly large congregation, but what's going on over here with these big doors. There you can see them again. Those doors were pocket doors. I think they went up into the attic. They were great big doors that they didn't want opening in or out, and lots of churches in the Congregational tradition, for instance, had this. It was part of an understanding about how you educated your kids and how you ran your services. So what we're looking at here, over on the right, is Commonwealth Avenue. Here's Chelmsford across the bottom. So the front of the church is here, all the pews are here, and then the altar and everything, here's the organ and the choir. So the church runs through this way. It's a fairly wide sanctuary space. But then there's this other axis that runs this way. So those pocket doors are right through here, and it goes into a room that's labeled Sunday school, and then there are a bunch of rooms that we would now call breakout rooms. So individual kind of graded Sunday school education would take place. They'd be with everybody at first, and then they'd close those doors. Then the kids would do some group activity, and then they'd split into grade levels. And it was a philosophy about how kids were incorporated into church and how they were educated at church that ended up having this architectural language that went along with it. It happens here in the Congregational church. There's nothing like it next door in the Episcopal church because it just wasn't part of that tradition. Here you can see that kind of octagonal, partial octagonal section where the Sunday school rooms were located. Okay, so our St. Matthew's folks also decide they're going to move. They decide they're going to buy a piece of property at Carter and Como. It was vacant. It was a nice, prominent location, so they were going to buy the spot where the library ended up. And then they decided, no, we're going to buy closer into the university. So they ended up still on Carter, but at Chelmsford rather than at Como, leaving this vacant so the library could be built in this spot. And they ended up with this. It was a $15,000 project. It was going to be more expensive than that, and they had to trim it back a little bit, but they did go the extra $600 to put stone on the whole outside of the building. It has the kind of look and feel of an English parish church, so its architectural models are a little bit different. Here's the inside of the building, so the beams in the ceiling, the stained glass, the long, narrow basilica. This is particularly suited to this congregation, this parish, and its type and form of worship. So Johnston isn't just saying, well, here's my church plan, take it or leave it. He was doing something that was quite specific for the organization. The building, the box of the building is still there. It was up high enough, again, so they could have windows into their basement, but that also allowed them to add on to the church without kind of totally surrounding the church in a way that made it invisible. They were able to add at the basement level. Pretty smart, pretty clever way of designing. Johnston did schools. We'll look at two of them quickly. He didn't actually do this one, but there's a story there. This is the Gutterson School. It was originally called the Murray School until the one up here was built. The Gutterson School was built in 1887, and it became overcrowded fairly quickly. In the early 20th century, the North St. Anthony Park Improvement League, bothering the city, calling them all the time, we need more classrooms, we need more schools, children are falling out the windows, the school is so overcrowded. Not the falling out the windows part, but you know what I mean. So they finally got the city to say, yep, okay, you're on the list, we'll get this built. And Johnston gets the commission in 1906 to add on to the building. And what they did is that they took off the tower. We're on the opposite side of the building now, so we're up Como. That's Commonwealth coming in. The tower is off the old building. So here we're at Knapp looking up towards Commonwealth. The other photo came down in the other direction. So the tower goes, they changed the dormers on the front. So they had big kind of pointy dormers, and now they just have little shed dormers, little light going into the attic probably. They doubled the classroom size. And as you can see in this photo, it wasn't enough because then they had to add more classroom space in separate buildings that had no bathrooms. And so the kids had to run into the main building to use the bathroom. So this project was approved. It was supposed to go ahead. Clarence Johnston had the commission for it. But the building permit said it went ahead in 1908, not 1906. And the architect was Cass Gilbert, not Clarence Johnston. So maybe there was a money problem from the city. Whatever it was, the project was delayed. Johnston wasn't available, or his bid came in too high on the second round. And there you go. Another neighborhood school that Johnston had a little bit of a hand in was the Breck School. Breck was founded in Wilder, Minnesota in the 1880s, and then they moved it to St. Anthony Park in 1915 and put it in this building, which now we just see as a house, right, facing College Park. For a while, it was in this building. This is the Samuel Green house. Samuel Green moved farther up Raymond, and so Breck School was here. They struggled, though, and in the 1920, they basically went on hiatus. But they had plans. Here's the Samuel Green house again. It's a little hard to see. This is a newspaper illustration from late 1920. They hired Clarence Johnston to kind of draw up some buildings for them. And they made this big fundraising push. We're going to have a campus. It's going to be adjacent, that's what they said, adjacent to the university. So students can come to school here in this sort of small environment. They can take some classes over at the university campus. It'll all be great. And then they can go to school there. 3 buildings altogether. There's one that you can kind of see over on the left, a tall dormitory in the middle, a chapel over on the right. And you can maybe just pick out Johnston's signature down here. So they didn't hire him to do plans, not yet. They hired him to draw up their fake campus, which was supposed to help them raise money, raise awareness, get people interested in the project. The campus was built, but nothing was designed by Johnston, and it took a little while to get it done. So here's the campus, and there's one building left, now called Stubb Hall, and here it's a little, I'll do a little pun on Stubb's name. It's a little stubby, because they put an addition on it, so it comes out farther this way. But they started with this building, which was on Hendon, middle of the block between Fulham and Como. And then they added this, which was classrooms. There's a gym on the lower level. There was a chapel through the middle. It was kind of everything. That was their main building. And then the dorm in 2 phases came later. And here's a fun picture from the Minnesota Transportation Museum. It's all about the streetcar, unless you're interested in looking in the background, in which case you can see what's now Stubb Hall, the dormitory building. There's what became Osgard Hall, the main building. That's where Lutheran Social Service sits. And we can't see the other building, which was right back up there. So Johnston had a hand in raising money for them. Here's one of his least glamorous projects, but not unusual. He did this in a number of examples. This is the Jean Martin Brown Receiving Home, the Children's Home Society, Commonwealth Terrace, St. Anthony Park Home. This is the original building. It was built as a place for orphans to be housed before they were placed with families. And it's from 1903. In 1915, they decided that they were going to build a powerhouse and boiler room on the back of the building. So it's a little detour. Don't forget Milton Square on Thursday night. But the reason I'm showing this is how geeky I am about pictures. This is a house that was built where the bank ended up being built. That's the Jean Martin Brown Receiving Home. And look at that. Is that their loading dock back there? What is that? There was an alley that went all the way through the block, and I was so excited to see that arch. I've never seen it on plans. But Johnston comes in, and he, I think, replaces that. They maybe weren't using that anymore. And he builds this one-story bump out, which was the boiler room. Again, not very elegant for the state's most popular architect, but he just happily took on, whatever happened to come up. He worked for the State Agricultural Society, aka the State Fair, and did a number of buildings. He did a prison display building in 1909, and that's torn down. I guess we don't do that anymore, but this is the cattle barn from 1920. 1,000 cows can be inside this building all at once, and the State Fair goers as well. So a big, gorgeous, elegant, prominent building that lots of people would see and use. We're going to finish with some business buildings, and I know this isn't a business building, but this is how architects' careers would go. This is the Blodgett House. Blodgett's company was Brown, Blodgett, and Sperry. 7 years after this house was built, his partner, Sperry, hired Johnston to do a house on Iglehart. So he knows this house, he liked it. Blodgett had good things to say about Johnston, and so it spawned another house project. And in 1922, the Brown, Blodgett, Sperry Company built this building at 1745 University Avenue, and this was their headquarters, and it was designed by Johnston. So he was versatile enough, here's another view of it, versatile enough to be able to respond to requests for lots of different types of buildings, well connected enough that the commissions just kind of kept coming in. And our last building is this one, farthest south in our group, also University Avenue. This one is actually in St. Anthony Park, unlike the last one, which was over just east of Fairview. This was a building for a store fixtures company. There were a lot of buildings along University Avenue that were showrooms for furniture companies and that sort of thing. And this was one of those things. So people from outside of the cities could come in, they could get, they could get things wholesale essentially and ship them out by rail on the Minnesota transfer trains to get to Fargo or wherever their store was. So this is a project, the Brown Jaspers building, and it was kind of partly warehouse, partly showroom. Very typical of these buildings. It has a lovely, in this case, Art Deco front, and then you get around the corner, it's not Casota stone anymore, it's Chaska brick, and it becomes more warehouse-like as you move back in. It's now, I think, underway as the Film North location. So here's a view of what they expect it will look like. When I first saw it, I thought, what, you're taking off the Art Deco decoration? But no, it's still there. They've just made it a little, they've calmed it down a little bit. So there you go, touring around St. Anthony Park, courtesy of Clarence Johnston. So I will let you know first that there are special treats tonight. Shauna Marjanovic has been experimenting with her freeze dryer and candy and has made some amazing things. Mary's still getting over the sweet taste. So stay and chat if you want to. I think she has boxes so you can take things with you. So if you're going to put on a mask, you'll be able to grab something to take home and test it there. Or once you get out the door, you can stuff something in your mouth. Any questions? Yeah, Adam.
What corner, do you know what corner at the intersection of Energy Park and Raymond that church was on?
The question was, where was the Congregational Church? It was on the southeast corner in the parking lot area for the apartment buildings. So not where the Tibetan Center is, it was across Energy Park from the Tibetan Center. Not where the park is, it was across Raymond from the park, and kitty corner from the strip mall. That's where they were. So kind of back to back with the houses on Everett Court. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, Mary, did you have